In the summer of 1588, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men set sail with a single purpose: to end Protestant England forever. It was the largest invasion fleet the Atlantic world had ever seen, assembled over years at a cost that nearly bankrupted the most powerful empire on Earth. But within 3 months, half that fleet lay on the ocean floor, and the map of the modern world had been redrawn. How did the most formidable armada in history fail so spectacularly, not to enemy cannons but to storms, miscalculation, and a queen who simply refused to lose? This documentary follows the full story from the slow-burning obsession of a Spanish king to the wreckage scattered across the coasts of Ireland, uncovering the real reasons the mightiest fleet ever assembled never made it home. In the year 1556, the most powerful man on earth sat down to rule. Philip II of Spain inherited a dominion so vast that his advisors struggled to describe it with any single word. It was not merely a kingdom. It was not merely an empire. It was something the world had never quite seen before. When his father, the Emperor Charles V, abdicated and retreated to a monastery in Extremadura, he passed to his son a collection of territories that spanned every known ocean. The Netherlands in the north, Naples and Milan in Italy, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon on the Iberian Peninsula, and beyond the horizon, stretching across the Atlantic and the Pacific, the staggering wealth of the Americas and the distant Philippine Islands, named in Philip's own honor just 3 years earlier. Consider the sheer arithmetic of this inheritance. From his palace outside Madrid, Philip governed roughly 40 million souls across 4 continents. Dispatches arrived from Manila, from Mexico City, from Lima, from Antwerp. Each morning brought news from a different world. But what truly separated Spain from every rival was silver. Deep in the Andes Mountains of present-day Bolivia, the mountain of Potosi had revealed itself as perhaps the single richest mineral deposit in human history. Spanish miners, working indigenous laborers under brutal conditions, extracted silver on a scale that defied imagination. The mines at Zacatecas in New Spain added further torrents of wealth. Between 1550 and 1650, Spanish galleons would carry approximately 180,000 tons of silver across the Atlantic. This was not merely money. It was power distilled into metal and shipped home on the wind. Philip used that power with a particular sense of purpose. He was, above all things, a Catholic. Not a casual Catholic, not a politically convenient Catholic, but a man who genuinely believed that God had placed him on his throne for a reason. He spent hours each day in prayer. He corresponded with the Pope as a fellow servant of heaven. He would personally review every significant decision of state, annotating documents with his own hand late into the night, long after his courtiers had gone to sleep. Those who served him learned that patience was required. Philip moved slowly, deliberately, and with the absolute certainty of a man who believed a divine approval accompanied his every decree. This combination, oceanic wealth, global reach, and unshakable religious conviction, produced a king who saw himself not merely as a sovereign but as a defender of Christendom itself. Europe's Protestant reformations were spreading. Heresy, in Philip's view, was not a theological inconvenience. It was an emergency. And far to the north, across the gray waters of the English Channel, a Protestant queen was sitting on a throne that Philip believed belonged, by rights, to a Catholic monarch. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was already becoming a problem. On the 17th of November, 1558, church bells rang across England. But these were not bells of mourning, though a queen had indeed just died. For many who heard them, the pealing carried something that sounded almost like relief. Mary I was dead, and her half-sister Elizabeth, 25 years old, and the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, was now Queen of England. The transition was electric. Elizabeth rode into London through streets lined with cheering crowds, her red hair catching the autumn light, her expression composed but her eyes alert to everything. She had survived imprisonment in the Tower. She had survived her sister's suspicion. She had survived, and now she would rule. For Philip II, sitting in his study outside Madrid, the news arrived wrapped in political complication. He had been married to Mary, Elizabeth's elder sister, and through that marriage had expected to maintain Spain's influence over England. Mary had been the ideal partner, a devoted Catholic who had burned nearly 300 Protestant dissenters at the stake during her reign. England, under Mary, had been moving back toward Rome. Now that architecture collapsed overnight. Elizabeth was Protestant by upbringing, by instinct, and by political necessity. The Catholic Church had never fully accepted her legitimacy, given that Rome did not recognize her father Henry VIII's annulment from his first wife. To be Catholic was, for Elizabeth, to be illegitimate. She had every reason to break with Rome, and she did so with characteristic precision. Between 1559 and 1563, Elizabeth and her chief advisor William Cecil constructed what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. The settlement was shrewd rather than savage. The Church of England was restored as the official church of the realm. The monarch became its supreme governor. The liturgy was reformed, the Latin Mass replaced with English services, and Protestant theology was enshrined in 39 articles of faith. Yet the settlement deliberately preserved enough ceremony and structure to keep moderate Catholics from open rebellion. It was a masterwork of political calculation. But across the Channel, it registered as something far simpler: heresy. Official, state-sponsored heresy. Philip initially responded with restraint, even proposing marriage to Elizabeth himself in the early months of her reign. He was refused. He tried diplomatic pressure, he tried persuasion, and he maintained ambassadors in London who reported back with mounting frustration. England was slipping away from Catholic influence, and its young queen seemed entirely comfortable watching it go. The ideological fracture that opened in these years was not merely religious. It was civilizational. Catholic Europe, anchored by Spain and the papacy, operated under one understanding of how Christian society should be ordered. Protestant England represented a direct challenge to that order. And England was not simply a theological abstraction. It sat at the mouth of the channel through which Spain's supply lines to the Netherlands ran like a vital artery. Every ship that sailed between Spain and its northern territories in Flanders passed within sight of English shores. Elizabeth knew this. Philip knew this. The geography of rivalry was written into the very map of Europe. By 1563, England's break from Rome was effectively complete, its Protestant settlement embedded in law, and its young queen firmly established on the throne. The religious foundations of the coming conflict were now in place. What remained to be added was motive, opportunity, and blood. Those would come soon enough from the streets of the Netherlands, where Spanish soldiers were about to make decisions that even Philip II could not fully anticipate. In the summer of 1566, something extraordinary swept through the cities of the Spanish Netherlands. It moved like a fever. Within days, thousands of ordinary men and women, Calvinist Protestants who had endured decades of Catholic rule, poured into churches across Flanders and Brabant, tearing down statues, smashing stained glass, and pulling altarpieces from the walls. Historians would call it the iconoclast fury. Those who witnessed it called it terrifying. Philip II, receiving reports in Madrid, was appalled. The Netherlands were the crown jewel of his northern empire. The port of Antwerp alone handled roughly 40% of all northern European trade. This was not merely a spiritual rebellion. It was an attack on the financial architecture of Spanish power. His response was to send a man whose methods were as blunt as his reputation. Fernando Álvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, marched north in 1567 with 10,000 veteran soldiers at his back. What followed made Philip's original problem considerably worse. Alba established a special tribunal to crush dissent. The Dutch called it the Council of Blood. In 6 years, it condemned over 12,000 people on charges of heresy and rebellion, executing somewhere between 1,000 and 1,800 of them, including 2 of the Netherlands' most prominent noblemen. Properties were confiscated. Taxes were raised. The heavy hand of Spanish authority pressed down on merchant cities that had grown accustomed to considerable autonomy. Rather than extinguishing revolt, Alba lit it into something sustainable. A Dutch resistance movement coalesced around William of Orange, a nobleman who had escaped Alba's initial purge and now coordinated resistance from exile. The northern provinces, particularly Holland and Zeeland, proved extraordinarily difficult to subdue. Their geography helped, a landscape of rivers, canals, and low ground that Spanish infantry could not simply march across. Elizabeth watched all of this from across the channel with an expression her court would have recognized: carefully neutral, privately fascinated, and quietly calculating. She could not openly support Protestant rebels against a sitting Catholic monarch. That precedent cut both ways. But she could allow English volunteers to cross into the Netherlands. She could look the other way when ships carrying supplies sailed from English ports. She could permit the Dutch sea beggars, rebel privateers operating against Spanish shipping, to use English harbors as refuge. She did all of these things, and Philip's ambassadors complained bitterly about every one of them. The Siege of Leiden in 1574 demonstrated what this resistance actually looked like in practice. Spanish forces surrounded the city for months, hoping starvation would accomplish what assault could not. The Dutch response was audacious. William of Orange ordered the sea dikes cut, flooding the surrounding countryside and allowing a rebel fleet to sail relief supplies directly to the city walls. Leiden held. And with it, so did the broader sense that Spanish power in the north was not, after all, inevitable. The strategic logic for England was becoming impossible to ignore. A Netherlands controlled absolutely by Spain meant Spanish garrisons sitting directly across the Channel, Spanish warships sheltering in Dutch ports, and Spanish authority positioned to strangle English trade. Elizabeth's support for Dutch rebels was not charity. It was geography made policy. By the mid-1570s, the Netherlands had become the bleeding wound at the center of Philip's empire, draining his treasury and consuming his soldiers at a rate that no silver fleet from the Americas could quite keep pace with. And in London, a Protestant queen continued to smile at Spanish ambassadors while her agents quietly kept the wound open. The question was no longer whether England and Spain were drifting toward confrontation. It was only a matter of what would finally bring them to open war. The answer, at least in part, came from the sea. While Philip's army slogged through Dutch canals and his diplomats filed protests in London, a quieter war was already underway across the Atlantic. It was fought not by armies but by sailors, sharp-eyed and ruthless, operating somewhere in the uncertain territory between patriotism and piracy. John Hawkins had made his fortune in the slave trade, running human cargo from West Africa to Spanish Caribbean colonies that were officially closed to English merchants. By 1568, he was returning from his third such voyage, his ships heavy with profit, when he was caught by a sudden storm and forced to shelter in the Mexican port of San Juan de Ulua. It was a catastrophic mistake. A Spanish fleet arrived carrying a new viceroy of New Spain. Negotiations for a peaceful coexistence quickly collapsed. Spanish forces attacked without warning, overwhelming the English ships in the harbor. Hawkins escaped with 2 vessels barely seaworthy. Hundreds of his men did not escape at all. Among those who clawed their way home alongside Hawkins was a young relative barely in his mid-20s named Francis Drake. He returned to England with no money, no cargo, and a grievance that would shape the next 2 decades of Anglo-Spanish relations. Drake never forgot San Juan de Ulua. He called the Spanish debt a personal one and spent his career collecting it. Through the early 1570s, Drake raided Spanish ports and mule trains in the Caribbean with a ferocity that embarrassed Philip's colonial administrators. In 1573, he intercepted a silver convoy crossing the Isthmus of Panama and stood, for the first time, looking out at the Pacific Ocean, that vast Spanish lake. He reportedly prayed to be granted the chance to sail it in an English ship. 4 years later, Elizabeth quietly granted that wish. In December 1577, Drake sailed from Plymouth with 5 vessels and a mission of spectacular ambition. He passed through the Strait of Magellan, became only the 2nd commander in history to circumnavigate the globe, and arrived back in Plymouth in September 1580, his hold stuffed with Spanish silver, spices, and plundered treasure. The haul was extraordinary, worth somewhere in the region of half of England's entire annual government revenue. Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his own ship. Philip received the news with cold fury. The wealth Drake stole was not merely symbolic. It represented the economic engine that powered Philip's entire strategic vision. Every year, the treasure of fleets that sailed from Havana carried the silver of Potosi and the gold of New Spain through the Atlantic to the port of Seville, where it was counted, taxed, and spent on soldiers, ships, and the maintenance of the largest empire the world had yet seen. The figures were staggering. In the 1570s alone, the Americas delivered something in the order of 85 tons of gold and silver annually into Spanish coffers. Drake was not stealing enough to break that system, but he was demonstrating something more dangerous than theft. He was demonstrating that it was vulnerable. Elizabeth accepted Philip's diplomatic protests with well-practiced regret and kept Drake's treasure. Her official position was that English sailors operating beyond the line, The imaginary boundary Spain claimed divided its exclusive colonial sphere were acting outside the protections of any treaty. Philip considered this a lie dressed in legal language. He was probably right. The undeclared war in the Atlantic was widening the fracture that had been growing for a decade. Dutch rebels, English privateers, Protestant solidarity, and naked commercial rivalry had all combined into something that could no longer be managed through ambassadors and careful words. In Madrid, Philip was beginning to reach a conclusion. Diplomacy had its limits, and a man of his resources had other options. In May of 1568, a young woman of 25 crossed the Solway Firth by boat, fleeing Scotland with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate faith that her cousin would protect her. Mary, Queen of Scots, had just watched her Scottish support collapse, her third husband discredited, her throne stripped away. She arrived in England expecting sanctuary. What she found instead was a gilded cage that would hold her for the next 19 years. Elizabeth's dilemma was immediate and agonizing. Mary was a Catholic queen with a plausible claim to the English throne, a figure around whom every discontented Catholic in England could rally. To release her was dangerous. To imprison her was diplomatically awkward. To execute her was unthinkable, at least for now. And so Elizabeth chose the slow option, keeping Mary under comfortable house arrest while her ministers wrestled with what to do next. The Catholic powers of Europe had no such hesitation about what Mary represented. She was the answer, the legitimate alternative to a Protestant queen who, in Rome's view, had no right to rule at all. Philip II, already hardening toward England over Drake's raids and Elizabeth's support for Dutch rebels, watched the situation carefully. He did not need to invent a conspiracy. He simply needed to encourage the ones that formed naturally around Mary's imprisonment. The first came in 1571. Roberto Rodolfi, a Florentine banker operating in London, carried letters between Mary, the Spanish ambassador, and the Duke of Norfolk, proposing a Spanish invasion to overthrow Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. Elizabeth's spymaster, William Cecil, unraveled it before a single soldier moved. Norfolk lost his head. Mary survived. 12 years passed. The plots kept coming. In 1583, the Throckmorton plot proposed another Spanish-backed invasion, again with Mary at its center. Elizabeth's new intelligence chief, Sir Francis Walsingham, broke that one too, forcing the conspirators into flight or onto the scaffold. Philip's ambassador was expelled from London. Relations between the two crowns descended another degree toward open war. Walsingham was perhaps the most formidable spy in 16th century Europe, a precise, humorless man who believed that Protestant England faced an existential threat and that only total vigilance could preserve it. He maintained a network of informants across the continent, intercepted correspondence, turned conspirators into double agents, and waited. He was waiting specifically for proof that would finally compel Elizabeth to act against Mary directly. He found it in 1586. A young Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington had organized a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and trigger a Spanish invasion with Mary's knowledge and support. Walsingham let the plot develop, his agents secretly decoding Mary's correspondence through a hidden channel concealed in a beer barrel. When Mary wrote back approving the plan, Walsingham had everything he needed. Mary was arrested in August 1586. Her trial, conducted before a commission of English nobles and councillors, lasted 2 days. She defended herself with intelligence and composure, denying any murderous intent. The evidence was overwhelming. She was found guilty of conspiring against the life of the Queen of England. Elizabeth delayed signing the death warrant for months, tormented by the implications. A queen executing a queen was a precedent that terrified her. When she finally signed in February 1587, she reportedly wept. Her secretary dispatched it before she could change her mind. On the 8th of February 1587, Mary walked into the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle dressed in crimson, the Catholic color of martyrdom. The executioner required 3 strokes of the axe. When he lifted her head to display it to the witnesses, her auburn wig came away in his hands, revealing the gray hair beneath. She was 44 years old. In Madrid, Philip received the news with something approaching relief. He had long been weighing the invasion of England. Mary's death removed his last complication. There would be no more waiting for another power's dynastic crisis to resolve his English problem for him. The time for proxies and plots was finished. Philip would build his fleet. By the summer of 1585, the slow slide toward war had become a sprint. The Dutch provinces, fighting for their survival against the Duke of Parma's methodical Spanish reconquest, sent their most desperate appeal yet to Elizabeth. They had already offered her sovereignty over the Netherlands, a crown she had declined. Now they asked for something simpler and more urgent. Soldiers. Money. A commitment. Elizabeth understood what saying yes would mean. It would mean crossing the line from covert support to open intervention, from plausible deniability to declared hostility. Philip could not ignore English troops fighting his army in the Netherlands. No diplomatic fiction could survive that. She signed the Treaty of Nonsuch on the 10th of August, 1585. The agreement obligated England to provide nearly 6,000 foot soldiers and 1,000 cavalry, along with substantial financial support for the Dutch cause. In exchange, England would hold the cautionary towns of Flushing and Brill as security against repayment. These were not gestures. These were acts of a nation choosing a side. Command of the expedition fell to Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's longtime favorite and perhaps the man closest to her heart for the better part of 3 decades. He arrived in the Netherlands in December 1585 to enormous celebration, the Dutch greeting him as a liberator. Within weeks, he had accepted the title of Governor-General, a move that embarrassed Elizabeth politically and tangled the expedition in complications before it had properly begun. Leicester was brave, loyal, and substantially out of his depth as a military commander. His campaign achieved little of strategic value. He quarreled with Dutch officials, struggled to pay and supply his troops, and found that enthusiasm was no substitute for experience against Parma's veterans. The intervention kept the Dutch cause alive, but fell far short of the decisive blow anyone had hoped for. What Leicester could not reverse, nothing could. Antwerp had already fallen. In August 1585, the very month Elizabeth signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, Parma completed his siege of the great commercial capital of the Netherlands. Antwerp had been the richest city in northern Europe, a financial and trading hub without parallel. Its fall sent shockwaves across the continent. Parma's army, the finest fighting force in the world at that moment, had demonstrated once again what it was capable of. Thousands of Protestant merchants fled north. The city never fully recovered. And Philip, surveying his general's achievement, had reason to feel that the momentum of history was with him. The treaty and the fall of Antwerp together convinced Philip that the English question could no longer be deferred. Elizabeth was not a nuisance to be managed through conspiracy and diplomatic pressure. She was an enemy to be defeated. Her troops were now killing his soldiers on Dutch soil. Her privateers, men like Francis Drake, had been raiding Spanish shipping and colonial ports for years with her tacit blessing. And now the woman who had sheltered his enemies and executed his preferred candidate for her throne had raised her banner openly against him. Through 1585 and into 1586, Philip began consulting his admirals and generals in earnest. The plan taking shape in his councils was breathtaking in its ambition. A great fleet would sail from Spain north through the English Channel, rendezvous with Parma's army waiting on the Flemish coast, and together they would cross to England and end, once and for all, the Protestant reign that had defied him for nearly 3 decades. The proxies and plots had failed. The diplomatic silences had curdled into something beyond repair. Now Philip turned to the one instrument he believed could settle the matter decisively. The fleet was coming. Philip II did not make decisions quickly. He was a man of paperwork and prayer, a king who governed from a small wooden desk in the Escorial, surrounded by mountains of dispatches that he annotated in his own careful hand. His ministers sometimes waited months for replies. His patience, depending on one's perspective, was either a virtue of careful governance or a maddening paralysis dressed up as wisdom. But by 1586, the decision had been made. England would be invaded. The man who first put numbers to this ambition was the Marquis of Santa Cruz, Spain's most celebrated admiral and the hero of Lepanto 15 years earlier. In the spring of 1586, Santa Cruz submitted a proposal to the king that was staggering in its scale. He wanted over 500 vessels, nearly 90,000 soldiers and sailors, and provisions sufficient for 8 months of campaigning. The cost would have bankrupted most kingdoms outright. Even Philip, whose American silver mines were the envy of every monarch in Europe, looked at those figures and recoiled. The plan was sent back for revision. What emerged instead was something more restrained, though restrained only by comparison. Philip's strategic concept was a masterpiece of coordination on paper and a logistical nightmare in practice. A great fleet, assembled in Lisbon and commanded by Santa Cruz, would sail north through the English Channel. Meanwhile, the Duke of Parma, whose battle-hardened army of roughly 17,000 veterans was already positioned in Flanders, would load his troops onto flat-bottomed barges and wait at the coast. The fleet would escort those barges across the channel, shielding them from English warships. Together, they would land in England, march on London, and install a Catholic monarch. The elegance of the plan concealed an almost absurd number of assumptions. That the fleet would survive the channel intact. That Parma's barges could reach open water without being intercepted by Dutch flyboats lurking in the shallow coastal passages. That the two forces could somehow coordinate their movements across hundreds of miles without reliable communication. That England itself would offer only token resistance. Philip did not dwell on these complications. He believed genuinely and deeply that God had chosen him for this mission. The enterprise of England, as he called it, was a holy war as much as a strategic operation. He had received papal blessing and the promise of a crusade indulgence for every man who fought under his banner. Across Spain, Portugal, southern Italy, and even into the Baltic, the machinery of empire ground into motion. Ships were requisitioned from merchant fleets. Timber was harvested, guns were cast, and barrels of salted beef and dried biscuit were loaded into warehouses in Lisbon harbor. Recruiting parties swept through Andalusia and Castile. By early 1587, the fleet gathering on the Tagus River had grown to something Europe had never quite seen before, over 130 ships, carrying perhaps 30,000 men between sailors and soldiers. The supply problem alone was almost incomprehensible. 30,000 men required roughly a pound of biscuit each per day. They needed water, wine, oil, vinegar, and meat. They needed powder and shot. They needed rope, canvas, and spare timber for repairs. Every barrel, every sack, every coil of rope had to be procured, transported, and loaded onto ships whose storage capacity was never quite equal to what the operation demanded. Philip followed every detail from his desk at the Escorial, sending a constant stream of instructions and revisions to his commanders. He specified routes. He drafted contingency orders. He anticipated scenarios his admirals had not yet considered. It was, in many ways, an extraordinary exercise of royal will. It was also a curse. His commanders in Lisbon found themselves bound by directives that had been written weeks earlier and no longer reflected conditions on the ground. Santa Cruz, aging and increasingly overwhelmed, struggled to bring the fleet to readiness. The ship sat in the Tagus through the autumn of 1586 and into the winter. And somewhere across the water in Plymouth Harbor, an English admiral was watching the horizon and forming a plan of his own. Francis Drake did not believe in waiting for the enemy to come to him. While Philip's fleet sat swelling in the Tagus through early 1587, Drake was already petitioning Queen Elizabeth for permission to strike first. He had watched the reports coming out of Lisbon with the calculating eye of a man who understood, better than most, that a fleet in harbor was still a fleet not yet at sea. That vulnerability, he argued, was an opportunity too precious to ignore. Elizabeth characteristically wavered. She granted permission, then sent orders revoking it. Drake, equally characteristically, was already sailing when those revocation orders arrived. On the 2nd of April 1587, his squadron of roughly 23 ships cleared the mouth of Plymouth Sound and turned south. What happened 19 days later in the harbor of Cadiz would pass into the mythology of English seafaring. Cadiz was one of Spain's most vital ports, a staging post for supplies and equipment flowing toward Lisbon and the gathering fleet. When Drake's ships appeared off the harbor entrance on the 19th of April, the Spanish were caught almost entirely unprepared. The guns guarding the harbor mouth were not yet properly manned. Dozens of ships sat at anchor, laden with provisions, their crews ashore or going about ordinary business in the afternoon sun. Drake simply sailed in. The attack lasted roughly 36 hours. English guns raked the anchored vessels at close range. Spanish ships that tried to resist were boarded and burned. Those that could not be sailed out as prizes were set alight where they sat. When Drake finally withdrew, he left behind the wreckage of approximately 30 vessels of various sizes, along with warehouses full of stores and tens of thousands of tons of provisions that the Armada could no longer count on. The harbor was choked with smoke and floating timber. He was not finished. Rounding the southwestern tip of Portugal to Cape St. Vincent Drake spent the following weeks ravaging the coastline, seizing small vessels and disrupting the coastal supply chain that fed Lisbon. Most critically, his men destroyed vast quantities of barrel staves, the curved wooden slats used to assemble the casks that stored every ship's water, wine, and provisions. It was unglamorous work, chopping and burning wood on Portuguese beaches. It was also devastating. Without seasoned barrel staves, the Armada would be forced to store its provisions in green, unseasoned wood. That wood would crack and warp at sea, spoiling everything inside it. The consequences for 30,000 men on a long voyage would prove catastrophic. Drake himself reportedly called it singeing the King of Spain's beard, a phrase that caught the imagination of England and has never quite let go. It captured something essential about the man, his gift not just for action, but for framing action as theater. The strategic result was blunt and undeniable. Philip's commanders in Lisbon, surveying the damage to their supplies and their schedule, could not ignore the arithmetic. The Armada could not sail in 1587. The provisions were gone, the ships were diminished, and the operation required rebuilding from the ground up. 1 full year had been stripped from Philip's timetable. It was a year in which England would strengthen its defenses, in which Elizabeth's admirals would sharpen their plans, and in which Santa Cruz himself would die, leaving the fleet's command to pass to a man with no experience of naval warfare whatsoever. Drake had done something no diplomat, no storm, and no amount of English gold had managed. He had bought his country time. Whether England would use that time wisely was a question the coming year would have to answer. The man who might have led the Armada to victory died in a bed in Lisbon on the 9th of February, 1588. Alvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, was the greatest admiral Spain had produced in a generation. He had fought at Lepanto. He had commanded the naval campaign that secured Portugal for Philip's empire. He understood deep water and deep strategy in equal measure, and for years he had been the operational heart of everything the Armada was meant to become. His death from typhus came at the worst possible moment, just as the fleet he had spent years assembling was finally approaching readiness. Philip II had no time for grief. He had a fleet to sail and a Protestant queen to unseat. Within days, he made his choice of replacement, and it was a choice that revealed something fundamental about how the Spanish crown understood power. The new commander would be Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, the 7th Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was one of the wealthiest and most respected grandees in all of Spain. He administered vast estates in Andalusia with genuine competence. He was loyal, devout, and unimpeachably aristocratic. He had also never commanded a fleet in battle. He had never, in any meaningful sense, commanded a fleet at all. To his considerable credit, Medina Sidonia knew it. His response to Philip's appointment letter is one of the more remarkable documents of the entire campaign. He wrote back in terms of almost painful candor, listing his own disqualifications in careful detail. He suffered from seasickness. He had no experience of the sea or of war upon it. He lacked the knowledge that such a command required. He begged the king to find someone more suitable. Philip was unmoved. In the 16th century Spanish court, aristocratic rank carried a weight that practical experience could not easily challenge. Medina Sidonia was a duke. He was reliable. He would represent the crown's authority with appropriate dignity. The king sent him to Lisbon anyway. And so the fleet that was meant to carry the destiny of Catholic Europe now passed into the hands of a man who had actively pleaded not to lead it. Those beneath him, the experienced naval officers, the pilots who knew the northern tides, could only absorb the news and carry on. What else was there to do? The ominous quality of that transition is difficult to overstate. Santa Cruz had understood the Armada's limitations and had lobbied, sometimes furiously, for the resources to correct them. Medina Sidonia would be dependent on subordinates he barely knew, commanding an enterprise whose technical demands were entirely foreign to him. The fleet was nearly ready. The provisions were loaded, the soldiers were mustered, the prayers had been said. But the man who understood how to fight at sea was in the ground, and his replacement was already asking questions that any experienced admiral would never have needed to ask. On the 28th of May, 1588, the people of Lisbon gathered at the waterfront to witness something they believed history would remember forever. 130 ships moved slowly out of the Tagus estuary, their sails catching the Atlantic wind, their banners streaming against a Portuguese sky. It was, by any measure, the largest naval force the Western world had ever seen assembled under a single flag. The numbers alone were staggering. 8,000 sailors worked the rigging and the oars. 18,000 soldiers stood ready to wade ashore on English soil and fight their way inland. And among them, several hundred priests. Because this was not merely a military expedition. Philip II had declared it a holy crusade, and heaven, he was certain, would do what Spanish steel alone could not. The fleet that departed Lisbon that May morning was an extraordinary collection of vessels, each with a different purpose and a different origin. At its core were the great galleons, the warships of the line, purpose-built for battle, their gun decks bristling with bronze and iron. Alongside them sailed the galleasses, hybrid vessels that combined oar and sail, inherited from Mediterranean tradition, powerful but poorly suited to the unpredictable swells of the North Atlantic. Then came the merchantmen, requisitioned from trade routes across the empire, their holds converted to carry ammunition, food, and the equipment of a conquering army. Supply hulks, dispatch vessels, and small pinnaces filled out the rest, a floating city more than a fighting force. Before any of them had moved a league, the spiritual weight of the mission was made visible. A banner blessed by Pope Sixtus V had been carried from Rome and presented to the fleet. It bore the image of Christ crucified, flanked by the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, with the Latin inscription asking God to arise and judge his cause. The Cardinal Archbishop of Lisbon had conducted a solemn benediction over the assembled fleet and its commander, the reluctant Duke of Medina Sidonia, who now stood at the head of Christendom's great enterprise whether he wished to or not. But God, it seemed, was not yet ready to cooperate. Within days of clearing the Portuguese coast, the Armada ran into weather that showed no interest in holy banners or royal ambitions. Atlantic storms, the kind that mariners along this coast had learned to fear over generations, scattered the fleet and drove it northward in disorder. Ships strained, provisions were spoiled by seawater, and the logistical cracks that Santa Cruz had warned about for years began to show themselves with brutal clarity. Medina Sidonia, genuinely seasick and privately horrified, did what a conscientious commander should do. He gathered what ships he could and made for the nearest shelter. The port of Corunna, on the northwestern tip of Spain, became the Armada's involuntary home for nearly 6 weeks. Ships needed repair. Food and water needed to be replaced. Men who had fallen ill needed to recover, and many did not. The delay gnawed at morale. Back in Madrid, Philip fasted and prayed and sent urgent letters demanding to know why his holy fleet was sitting in a Spanish harbor rather than sailing to its destiny. By mid-July, Medina Sidonia had done what he could. The ships were patched, the provisions restocked, the soldiers reminded of their divine purpose. On the 22nd of July, 1588, the Armada put out from Corunna for the second time, now pointed unmistakably toward the English Channel. The English were waiting. Francis Drake had already tried to disrupt the fleet months earlier with his famous raid on Cadiz, delaying it by a year. Now, along the Channel coast, signal beacons stood ready on every hilltop, waiting for the first sighting of those enormous sails on the horizon. 2 fleets, 2 queens, 2 faiths, and the accumulated tension of decades were now converging on a narrow strip of water that would within days become the stage for one of history's most consequential naval confrontations. While the Spanish Armada labored through Atlantic storms and crowded into the harbor at Corunna, England was doing something it had been doing with remarkable frequency throughout Elizabeth's reign, preparing for an invasion that everyone expected and nobody was entirely certain how to stop. The Queen's response to the threat was, characteristically, both theatrical and shrewd. She understood that war is as much a contest of morale as of arms, and she moved to shore up both simultaneously. At the center of England's naval preparations stood Charles Howard, the second Baron Howard of Effingham, appointed Lord Admiral in 1585. Howard was not a man whose name inspires immediate recognition the way Drake's does, but that was precisely the point. Elizabeth chose him carefully. He was a nobleman of unimpeachable loyalty, a competent administrator, and crucially, someone whose aristocratic rank gave him the authority to command men like Francis Drake without provoking the kind of ego-driven chaos that could sink a fleet before it ever saw the enemy. Howard proved wise enough to lean heavily on his subordinates' expertise while keeping the enterprise coherent. Those subordinates were formidable. Drake himself commanded a squadron, his reputation for audacity and his intimate knowledge of Spanish tactics making him invaluable. John Hawkins, architect of much of the fleet's modernization, served alongside him. Martin Frobisher, the blunt Yorkshire navigator who had searched for the Northwest Passage and found instead a talent for naval combat, rounded out the senior command. The ships they commanded reflected a philosophy fundamentally different from Spain's, where the Armada was built around size and the assumption that naval battles were essentially land battles fought at sea, with boarding parties and hand-to-hand combat deciding outcomes. The English had arrived at a different conclusion. Their vessels were lower, faster, and more maneuverable. They could change course quickly, run upwind when needed, and, most importantly, carry guns designed to fire repeatedly at distance. The English doctrine was straightforward. Stay out of grappling range, pound the enemy with sustained artillery fire, and let the guns do what soldiers couldn't. It was a modern idea in a world still half committed to medieval assumptions about combat. Along the coast, a different kind of preparation was underway. England's inland defense rested on 2 systems that, together, were meant to buy time and concentrate force. The first was the beacon network, chains of signal fires positioned on hilltops and headlands from Cornwall to London. When the Armada was sighted, one fire lit would trigger the next within minutes, carrying the alarm across the country faster than any horse. The second was the militia muster. Tens of thousands of men, most of them farmers and tradesmen with varying degrees of military training, assembled under county lieutenants to form the land army that would resist any Spanish force that actually made it ashore. Whether that militia could have stopped 18,000 veteran Spanish soldiers is a question history, fortunately, never fully answered. Elizabeth herself provided something no admiral or general could supply: her genius for symbolic leadership, for making her subjects feel that their cause was not merely political but personal and sacred, would soon find its greatest expression. The Queen, who had inherited a divided, exhausted kingdom, was about to remind England and the world exactly who she was. The fleet at Plymouth was ready. The beacons were stacked and dry. The commanders knew their orders. All that remained was for those enormous Spanish sails, last seen disappearing into the Atlantic from Corunna, to reappear on the horizon to the south and west. They would not have long to wait. On the morning of July 29, 1588, a Cornish sea captain named Thomas Fleming was sailing the approaches west of the Lizard when he saw something that stopped his breath. To the south and west, stretching across the horizon in both directions, was a forest of sails. He counted masts until counting became meaningless. He turned his vessel north and drove for Plymouth as fast as wind and oar could carry him. The Spanish Armada had arrived. What Fleming had seen was arguably the most powerful fleet ever assembled in European waters up to that point. 130 ships carrying perhaps 18,000 soldiers and 7,000 sailors, arranged into a formation that would become one of the most recognizable images of the age. The Armada's commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had ordered his fleet into a great crescent, its horns sweeping forward on either flank, its strongest warships anchoring each tip. The formation stretched nearly 7 miles from point to point. It moved with ponderous, deliberate confidence, like something that understood it could not be stopped, only endured. When Fleming's ship reached Plymouth Harbor, the story passed almost immediately into legend. Francis Drake, the legend insists, was on the bowling green above the harbor when the news arrived, competing in a game of bowls with his fellow officers. Told that the Spanish were in the Channel, Drake reportedly replied that there was time enough to finish the game and beat the Spanish afterward. Whether he actually said it matters less than the fact that England believed he would. The story captured something essential about Drake: his studied contempt for panic, his instinct for the theatrical gesture that steadied men around him. The reality behind the legend was considerably more urgent. The English fleet faced a genuinely dangerous problem. Plymouth Harbor faced south and west, directly into the wind that was currently pushing the Armada up the channel. To get out of harbor and engage the enemy, the English ships would need to work their way out against that wind. A painstaking process of tacking and warping that consumed the rest of July 29th and stretched into the early hours of July 30th. Every hour spent beating out of Plymouth was an hour the Armada spent advancing. The seamanship required was extraordinary, and the fact that Howard and Drake managed it with their fleet intact and in fighting order was itself a significant achievement. Those who watched the Armada pass from the clifftops of Cornwall and Devon described a sight that defied easy comprehension. The great hulls rose from the water like floating fortresses. Banners and pennants caught the summer breeze. The sound that reached shore was not the crash of guns, but something more unsettling. A low, collective groan of timber and rigging, the breathing of something enormous. Church bells rang along the coast. The beacon fires that England had spent months preparing flared to life on every headland, the signal racing inland toward London at the speed of flame. Elizabeth would know before nightfall. By the morning of July 30th, the English fleet had successfully clawed out of Plymouth and positioned itself upwind of the Armada to the southwest. Howard and Drake had accomplished what the Spanish had hoped to prevent. The English now held the weather gauge, the crucial tactical advantage of the upwind position, meaning they could choose when and how to engage. The Crescent and its hunters were now in the same sea. The channel, never wide enough to feel truly safe, had just become considerably more dangerous. What followed in the coming days would test every theory both fleets had built their strategies upon and shatter more than a few of them. The first guns of the campaign fired on the morning of July 31st, 1588, off the coast of Plymouth, and they settled nothing. The English had the weather gauge. They had faster, more maneuverable ships. They had commanders who understood what those advantages meant. What they discovered almost immediately was that advantages mean little against an enemy who refuses to cooperate. Howard opened the engagement by sending his fleet in a long line past the Armada's southern flank, each ship raking the Spanish formation with cannon fire before wheeling away. Drake led a parallel attack against the northern flank. It was disciplined, professional, and deeply frustrating. The Armada's crescent simply absorbed the punishment. Medina Sidonia had instructed his captains to hold formation above all else, and hold it they did, the great hulls maintaining their intervals while English shot tore through rigging and splintered wood. The Spanish returned fire, but could not close the range. Their strategy required them to grapple and board. The English strategy required them to stay precisely far enough away to make grappling impossible. The Battle of Portland Bill on August 2nd sharpened this tension into something almost maddening for both sides. The wind shifted unexpectedly, briefly handing the Spanish the weather gauge, and for a few hours the dynamic threatened to reverse entirely. Spanish commanders pushed hard to close the distance. English captains scrambled to recover their position. The fighting grew closer and louder than anyone had planned, but the Armada's formation, tested and strained, held once more. When the wind shifted back, the English resumed their harrying from safe distance, and the Armada resumed its steady progress up the channel. August 4th brought the Battle of the Isle of Wight, and with it a moment of genuine alarm. There were anchorages near the island where the Armada might shelter and regroup, waiting for Parma's army from the Spanish Netherlands. If Medina Sidonia managed to seize a protected position and hold it, the strategic situation would shift dramatically. Howard threw his ships forward more aggressively than before, accepting closer range and heavier fire to push the Spanish away from the island shores. The Armada responded, and the fighting was the most intense the Channel had yet witnessed. But the Spanish could not force the anchorage, and the English would not let them rest. By evening, the Armada had passed the Isle of Wight and was in the open water of the Eastern Channel, without a harbor and without the rendezvous with Parma that the entire enterprise depended upon. Yet England had not won anything. Not yet. 4 days of running battle had produced a result that satisfied no one. The English captains were consuming ammunition at a rate that alarmed their commanders. Requests for resupply went to London with increasing urgency. The Spanish formation had been battered incrementally, ship by ship, but it had not broken. Several Spanish vessels had been lost to accident and to the fighting, but the Great Crescent continued its advance with something approaching contemptuous stubbornness. Both fleets were in different ways running out of options. The English had the speed and the position but lacked the firepower to deliver a decisive blow at long range. The Spanish had the soldiers and the discipline, but could not force the close-quarters battle their tactics required. Something had to change. And as the Armada rounded toward the Flemish coast and the English captains gathered in council, Francis Drake and others were already considering a weapon that required no ammunition at all. The fireships were coming. On the evening of August 6, 1588, the Spanish Armada dropped anchor in the roadstead off Calais. After a week of punishing battle up the length of the English Channel, the Great Crescent had reached the closest point it would ever come to its objective. England was barely 30 miles away across the gray water. And yet, in those shallow anchorages off the French coast, something was already beginning to unravel. Medina Sidonia had no choice but to stop here. His orders from Philip II were explicit. Find the Duke of Parma, link the fleet with the invasion army waiting in the Spanish Netherlands, and escort those troops across the channel to the English shore. The plan had a certain brutal logic on paper. In reality, it carried within it a flaw so fundamental that it is almost impossible to believe no one had resolved it before the fleet ever left Lisbon. The messages Medina Sidonia sent to Parma that evening were urgent to the point of desperation. Where were the barges? When could the army embark? The Armada could not wait indefinitely in open water, exposed to wind and tide in the English fleet closing from the west. He needed answers. He needed Parma. The answers that came back were not what anyone in Madrid had imagined. Parma's army, 17,000 veterans camped along the Flemish coast, was not ready. It could not be ready. And the reason lay not in any failure of will or preparation, but in something far more fundamental. The shallow waters of the Flemish coast, the approaches to Dunkirk and Newport where Parma's flat-bottomed barges sat loaded and waiting, were patrolled by a fleet of Dutch rebel flyboats. These small, nimble craft drew almost no water at all. They could operate in depths where the Armada's great galleons would run aground in an instant. The Spanish fleet had no way to reach Parma. Parma had no way to reach the Spanish fleet. The two halves of Philip's grand design were separated by a stretch of shallow water that neither could cross to help the other. This was the fatal silence at the heart of the enterprise. Philip had designed a plan requiring two forces to meet at sea, but he had never secured a deep water port where that meeting could actually occur. Medina Sidonia needed somewhere to anchor safely while Parma embarked. There was nowhere. Calais roads offered no real shelter. The anchorage was exposed, the holding ground poor, and the governor of Calais, a French official with no obligation to Spain, made politely clear that the fleet could not expect to remain indefinitely in French waters. To the west, the English were not idle. Howard had been reinforced. Fresh ships and, crucially, fresh ammunition had reached the fleet. The English commanders gathered in council aboard Howard's flagship, and what they discussed was not another artillery exchange. The weapon they had been preparing since Drake first proposed it required neither cannonball nor gunpowder in any conventional sense. 8 ships were being selected from the fleet. Combustibles were being packed into their holds. Pitch was being spread across their decks and rigging. Their guns were loaded so they would fire as the heat reached them, adding chaos to the fire and smoke. Their volunteer skeleton crews would sail them to within range of the anchored armada, light the fires, and then escape by boat into the darkness. The Spanish commanders knew that fireships were possible. Some had even heard the word hellburners, and with it the memory of Antwerp, only 3 years past, where ships packed with explosives had killed hundreds in a single terrible moment. In the roadstead off Calais, surrounded by darkness and doubt, the Armada waited for a dawn that would bring with it the worst night it had ever known. Midnight came quietly to the roadstead off Calais on August the 7th, 1588. A light wind blew from the southwest. The Armada rode at anchor in the darkness, its lanterns casting small pools of yellow light across the black water. Then someone on watch saw them coming. 8 ships, spread across a front perhaps half a mile wide, moving with the wind and tide toward the anchored fleet. They were already burning from stem to stern, their rigging alive with fire, their reflections shimmering and rippling across the surface of the channel. They made no sound at first beyond the roar of their own flames. Then the guns began to fire, loaded weapons discharging randomly as the heat reached them, invisible shots screaming out into the darkness in every direction. The Spanish lookouts had perhaps minutes of warning, perhaps less. The fear that seized the Armada in those moments was not simply the fear of fire. It was something deeper, something rooted in a specific memory that every experienced Spanish sailor carried with him. 3 years earlier, in 1585, during the siege of the Dutch city of Antwerp, a Flemish engineer named Federico Giambelli had designed a weapon unlike anything the age had seen. 2 ships packed not merely with combustibles, but with enormous quantities of gunpowder, their holds engineered to create a delayed explosion of catastrophic force. When those ships detonated against the Spanish siege bridge across the Scheldt River, the blast killed over 800 Spanish soldiers in an instant. The survivors called them hellburners. The word had never lost its power. Now, in the darkness off Calais, every man who saw those burning ships approaching could not know whether they were simple fireships or something far worse. Medina Sidonia had stationed a small guard of pinnaces to intercept exactly this threat, with orders to grapple the burning vessels and tow them clear. 2 of the fireships were caught and redirected. The other 6 came on. The order that went through the Armada was the order that unraveled everything. Cut the cables. There was no time to weigh anchor properly, no time for any controlled response. Across the fleet, captains gave the command, and sailors with axes hacked through the anchor cables that held their ships in position. In minutes, the most disciplined, most carefully maintained naval formation of the age dissolved into chaos. Ships lurched forward with the wind, their remaining anchors gone or their cable cutting only partially complete, swinging unpredictably in the darkness. The crescent formation that had held through days of English attack, that had protected the fleet's vulnerable flanks and allowed the Spanish to dictate the terms of engagement all the way up the channel, that formation ceased to exist in roughly the time it takes a fire to spread from one rope to another. The fireships themselves caused almost no direct damage. Not a single Spanish vessel was actually burned. But they did not need to destroy anything to accomplish their purpose. The destruction they caused was invisible, structural, final. A fleet that loses its formation in the dark off a lee shore, surrounded by enemies and deprived of most of its anchors, has lost something it cannot easily recover. Dawn on August the 8th revealed the Armada scattered across a wide stretch of sea north of Calais. Medina Sidonia's own flagship had managed to re-anchor and had returned south, flying signals ordering his captains to regroup. Most could not comply. Some had drifted miles to the northeast. The San Lorenzo, flagship of the galleasses, had fouled her rudder in the chaos and lay crippled, eventually running aground near Calais harbor, where she was taken by English longboats within sight of the Spanish fleet. The English knew exactly what the morning meant. Howard's fleet formed up to the west as the sun rose over the Flemish coast. The Armada was scattered, most of its anchors gone, pushed toward the shoals of Zealand by the same southwest wind that had carried the fireships home. The battle that would follow off Gravelines would be the most savage fighting of the entire campaign. And, for the first time, the Spanish would face it without the one defense that had kept them alive. The English came in close that morning. Closer than they had dared at any point during the long-running fight up the channel. For 10 days, Howard and Drake had kept a respectful distance, trading shot with a formation that could absorb punishment and still threaten to engulf any ship that ventured too near. That formation was gone now. What remained was a scattered collection of individual vessels, each fighting its own desperate battle for sea room, and the English recognized the opportunity with cold precision. The tactics changed completely. Where the English had previously engaged from distances of 300 yards or more, on August the 8th they closed to effective gunnery range, sometimes within 100 yards, near enough to see the faces of the men working the Spanish guns. At those distances, the physics of naval combat transformed entirely. Spanish cannon shot that had punched through empty air now found timber. English culverins and demi-culverins, weapons designed to throw heavy iron across a sustained rate of fire, began to tear through Spanish hulls below the waterline. The sounds of the battle off Gravelines carried for miles inland. Witnesses on the Flemish coast reported a continuous rolling thunder that lasted through most of the daylight hours, the separate discharges blending into something that resembled a permanent storm on the horizon. The Spanish fought back with everything they had. Individual captains and their crews displayed a courage that even their enemies would later acknowledge. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, absorbed punishment that would have sent most vessels to the bottom, her crew plugging shot holes with whatever came to hand, her gunners working their pieces until the barrels ran hot. Francisco de Recalde brought the San Juan back into the thickest fighting despite wounds he had carried since the earlier engagements in the Channel. These were not men who broke easily. But heroism in isolation is a different thing from coordinated resistance, and the Armada could no longer coordinate anything. Several ships drifted beyond the point of no return. Pushed northeast by the persistent southwest wind, unable to claw back against it with the sea room they needed, they found themselves approaching the shallow sandbanks of the Flemish coast, the shoals of Zealand that English navigators knew and Spanish pilots did not. The Maria Juan went down, taking most of her company with her. Others grounded or came within fathoms of doing so, their leadsmen calling depths that left no margin for survival. What saved the remaining Armada from complete annihilation was not Spanish resistance, but English ammunition. By mid-afternoon, Howard's ships had expended the bulk of their powder and shot. The intensity of the engagement began to slacken not because the English chose to relent, but because they had nearly nothing left to fire. Then the wind shifted. A sudden squall came up from the northwest in the late afternoon, pushing the scattered Spanish ships away from the Flemish sandbanks and separating the two fleets. For the exhausted crews of the Armada, it must have seemed like a direct intervention. The shoals that had threatened to swallow them whole fell away to leeward. The English pursuit eased as the weather closed in. When the squall passed and the fleets could see one another again, something fundamental had changed. The English had no ammunition for a renewed engagement. The Spanish had enough sea room to survive the night. The immediate crisis, the prospect of the entire Armada breaking apart on the Flemish banks within sight of Parma's army, had passed. But the battle had decided the campaign. The Armada was battered, low on ammunition, short of anchors, and pointed northeast into the North Sea. The road back to the Channel, and to any hope of fulfilling its mission, was closed behind it. While the guns at Gravelines still echoed in memory, England did not yet know it was safe. The Armada had been driven northward, yes, but no messenger had arrived to declare the danger finished. Along the Thames estuary, at the fortified camp of Tilbury in Essex, roughly 20,000 English soldiers waited in genuine uncertainty, prepared to meet the Duke of Parma's veterans if they crossed the water. It was into this atmosphere of suspended dread that Elizabeth I chose to ride. On August the 9th, 1588, the 54-year-old queen arrived at Tilbury on horseback. She wore a white velvet gown beneath a steel breastplate, a deliberate piece of theater that communicated everything words alone could not. Here was their commander. Here was their sovereign, not watching from a palace window, but among them, armed as they were armed, sharing whatever fate Providence intended to deliver. The soldiers who watched her ride through the camp that morning saw something they would describe for the rest of their lives. A woman who had every reason to remain behind walls, choosing instead to present herself to the wind and the crowd and the possibility of danger. Her master of the horse, the Earl of Leicester, walked beside her. A page carried her helmet on a cushion. Every detail had been calculated, and yet the effect transcended calculation. She stopped before her assembled troops and spoke. The words she delivered that morning would become among the most quoted in the English language. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she told them, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She promised to live or die among them, to lay down her honor and her blood in the dust alongside theirs. She called them her people, her strength, her subjects worthy of the greatest prince in Europe. The effect was electric. Veterans who had fought in the Low Countries, conscripts who had never left their county, officers and common pikemen alike, all of them heard their queen refuse the limitations that her age assigned to her sex and her position. The roar that answered her carried across the marshes of Essex. It was political genius wrapped inside genuine courage. Elizabeth understood, as few monarchs before or since have understood, that a nation's willingness to fight depends not just on resources and tactics, but on belief. She gave her army something that afternoon that no amount of cannon or cavalry could supply: the absolute conviction that what they defended was worth defending. Within days, the news would arrive. The Armada had not turned back. It was running north, battered and broken, unable to return through the channel it had once sailed so proudly down. The invasion that had threatened to end England's Protestant experiment was over. But the memory of Tilbury would last far longer than the crisis that produced it. A queen on horseback, in armor, speaking the words that made a nation. The same day Elizabeth addressed her troops at Tilbury, the men who commanded the fleet she celebrated were gathered around a table aboard a damaged flagship, facing a question with no good answer. Medina Sidonia's Council of War, convened on August 9, 1588, surveyed the situation plainly. The channel lay behind them, held by English warships. Parma's army remained sealed on the Flemish coast, unreachable. Their water casks were fouled or empty, their food was rotting, and the hulls of dozens of ships carried wounds that no available port could repair. Going back the way they had come was not a choice. It was a death sentence written in naval arithmetic. The only route home was forward. North around Scotland, then south along the Irish coast and back to Spain. It was a journey of roughly 3,000 miles through some of the most treacherous waters in the world in late summer, with a fleet that had already been through hell. Medina Sidonia issued his sailing orders with one instruction he repeated with particular urgency. Every captain was to stand well clear of the Irish and Scottish coastlines. No stops. No anchorage. The rocks and shoals along those coasts were poorly charted and genuinely murderous. He understood, perhaps better than his captains could fully appreciate, that a damaged ship tempted toward land by desperation might find only destruction waiting there. Whether those orders would be obeyed when storms came and ships began to fail was another matter entirely. The English fleet moved with them for a time, shadowing the Armada's progress northward. Howard and Drake tracked the retreating Spanish columns up the eastern coast of England, maintaining pressure without committing to renewed battle. Both sides were dangerously short of powder and provisions. What had once been the most powerful fleet ever assembled in northern Europe was now a procession of the exhausted following the defeated. The pursuit ended near the Firth of Forth, off the Scottish coast. Howard made the calculation that hunger and disease among his own crews posed a greater threat than the Armada now posed to England. He turned south. The Spanish continued north. No fanfare marked the moment. No final exchange of broadsides. The two fleets simply separated, each carrying its own desperate burdens back toward home. Then the Armada moved beyond the familiar world entirely, out into the open Atlantic, where the winds of late summer were beginning to shift toward something more violent and less forgiving. The ships that entered those waters were not the fleet that had sailed from Lisbon in May. Their rigging was jury-rigged, their crews riddled with dysentery and scurvy, their captains navigating by charts that would prove fatally inadequate. They had survived the English. What lay ahead of them now was something no admiral could command and no council of war could outmaneuver. The North Atlantic in autumn did not negotiate. They had survived the English guns. They would not survive the weather. September arrived over the North Atlantic with a violence that seemed almost deliberate. The winds that had been merely punishing became something else entirely, something primal and indifferent to the distinction between mighty fleet and helpless wreckage. Storm after storm rolled in from the west, each one finding the battered ships of the Armada somewhere along the long curve of Scotland and Ireland's coastlines, each one extracting its own toll in timber and rope and human life. The navigational charts the Spanish captains carried were, in many cases, worse than useless. They underestimated the westward reach of Ireland's coastline by significant margins, and those errors would prove fatal. Ships that believed themselves safely offshore found breakers suddenly appearing through the spray and darkness, rocks that no chart had warned them about, shores they had not known were there until the hulls were grinding against them. The losses accumulated with terrible speed. Ships came apart on the reefs of Fair Isle, wedged between Orkney and Shetland. Others drove onto the rocky coasts of the Hebrides, their exhausted crews unable to work the rigging well enough to claw back into open water. Along the western coast of Ireland, from Donegal down to Clare and beyond, the Atlantic received the Armada's dead across hundreds of miles of shoreline. The numbers were staggering. At least 24 ships were lost in the storms, perhaps more. Thousands of men drowned in water so cold that those who survived the initial wreck frequently died before they could reach shore. Those who did reach shore often found that survival had merely postponed their fate. English administration in Ireland was thin and fearful, governing a restless population with limited troops and considerable anxiety. Lord Deputy William Fitzwilliam issued orders that left little room for ambiguity. Spanish survivors were to be killed. Whether this reflected genuine military concern about armed men reinforcing Irish resistance, or simply the cold arithmetic of a colonial administration that could not afford complications, the result was the same. Soldiers moved along the beaches and cliffs, and the men who had crossed half the world to conquer England were put to death on the Irish shore. Some survived through the protection of local Gaelic chieftains who had their own complicated relationships with English authority and their own reasons for defiance. But nothing in the entire catastrophe concentrated the scale of loss into a single image quite like the fate of the Girona. A galleass rather than a galleon, she had already taken on survivors from other wrecked vessels when she attempted to round the northern tip of Ireland in late October. She carried perhaps 1,300 men, far beyond any reasonable capacity, when she struck the rocks at Licata Point off County Antrim on the 28th of October, 1588. Of those 1,300 souls, 5 survived. 5. The wreck of the Girona would remain on the ocean floor for nearly 4 centuries until divers discovered her in 1967, recovering jewels, gold chains, and personal effects from men who had sailed from Lisbon believing they were bound for glory. By the time the storms finally relented, the Armada had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Scattered ships staggered southward through autumn swells, their crews reduced to drinking urine, their livestock dead, their wounded beyond any help that remained aboard. What had Philip II built? What had Medina Sidonia commanded? By October, those questions were almost philosophical. The men still alive were simply trying to reach home. They came home in pieces. Medina Sidonia's flagship, the San Martin, limped into the northern Spanish port of Santander in mid-September of 1588. She was barely recognizable as the vessel that had led 130 ships out of Lisbon with such solemn ceremony 5 months before. Her hull was riddled, her crew devastated by sickness and starvation, her commander a broken man who had to be carried ashore too ill to walk under his own strength. The weeks that followed brought more ships, or what was left of them. Battered hulls crawling into Santander, Corunna, and other northern ports, crewed by ghosts. Roughly 67 of the original 130 vessels that had departed in the spring made it back to Spanish waters. More than half the fleet was simply gone, swallowed by the English Channel, the Atlantic storms, the reefs of Ireland, or some combination of all three. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. An estimated 15,000 men had died over the course of the campaign, and the cruelest arithmetic belonged not to English cannon but to weather, disease, and shipwreck. The guns at Gravelines and along the Channel had been terrible enough. But it was dysentery, scurvy, drowning, and the cold indifference of Atlantic storms that filled the final accounting. England had wounded the Armada. The sea had destroyed it. Philip II received the news at the Escorial, his great palace outside Madrid, the building that embodied his vision of Spanish power and divine purpose. His reported response has echoed down through the centuries. He had sent his ships to fight against men, he said, not against God's winds and waves. Whether the words were spoken in genuine faith, in political calculation, or simply in the stunned quiet of a man trying to comprehend a disaster of this scale, they reveal something essential about Philip. He did not abandon his conviction that God favored his cause. He absorbed the catastrophe and folded it into his theology. The Armada had failed. God's purposes remained intact. Medina Sidonia had no such consolation available to him. The commander, who had begged not to be given the assignment, who had catalogued his own inadequacies in writing before the fleet ever sailed, returned to his estates at Sanlúcar de Barrameda and largely withdrew from public life. History has debated his performance across the centuries, some arguing he managed an impossible situation with considerable skill, others less forgiving. But in the autumn of 1588, the debate was simple. Spain had sent an armada. The Armada had failed. Someone bore responsibility for that failure. The ports of northern Spain filled with the sounds of grief and the smell of disease as the surviving ships disgorged their cargoes of dying men. A fleet that had once seemed to represent the absolute apex of European power had returned as evidence of its limits. The age of Spanish invincibility, at least in English minds, was over. History does not always remember its failures symmetrically. The Spanish Armada of 1588 became legend, a watchword for hubris and divine judgment, a story retold across centuries. What came next has been largely forgotten. It should not be. Less than a year after the shattered remnants of Philip's fleet crawled back to Spanish ports, England launched its own armada. The same sea, the same ambitions, the same catastrophic result. In the spring of 1589, Queen Elizabeth authorized a massive naval expedition under two commanders, Sir Francis Drake, the most celebrated sailor in England, and Sir John Norris, a veteran soldier of considerable reputation. The force they assembled was staggering. Nearly 150 ships and roughly 18,000 men, an enterprise rivaling the Spanish effort in its sheer scale and surpassing it in its audacity. The objectives were threefold: destroy what remained of the Spanish fleet in its northern ports, install the Portuguese pretender Dom Antonio on the throne in Lisbon, and intercept the Spanish treasure fleet returning from the Americas. It was, on paper, a plan to finish what 1588 had started. It unraveled almost immediately. The expedition struck first at Corunna, on Spain's northwestern coast, where a portion of the surviving Armada vessels lay at anchor. The English managed to sack the lower town and destroy some supplies, but the main Spanish fleet sheltered in the harbor's upper reaches, protected behind fortifications the English could not crack. Days passed. Men died of disease, as they always did on such expeditions. The element of surprise dissolved into a grinding, inconclusive assault that produced little of military value. Then came Lisbon, the expedition's great prize. Norris marched his troops overland while Drake waited with the fleet at the mouth of the Tagus River. The Portuguese population, expected to rise in welcome of Dom Antonio and rebel against their Spanish rulers, did nothing of the sort. The two English forces never properly coordinated. Drake failed to bring his ships up the river. Norris found himself before the walls of Lisbon with insufficient artillery, dwindling supplies, and no popular uprising to support him. He retreated. The treasure fleet was never found. Elizabeth was furious. Drake had been explicitly ordered to strike the Armada remnants first and decisively. He had not done so. The Queen, who understood naval strategy better than many gave her credit for, recognized disobedience when she saw it. The losses the English suffered rivaled Spain's own catastrophe the previous year. Thousands of men dead, most of them taken by disease rather than enemy action. Ships lost. Treasure spent. Reputation bruised. The sea, it turned out, played no favorites. Two great powers had each assembled the most formidable fleet they could muster and sent it against the other. Both had come home broken. The war between England and Spain would grind on for years yet, but the illusion of decisive naval victory had been stripped from both sides. The lesson of 1589 should have been humbling for both crowns. For Philip II of Spain, it was something else entirely. It was motivation. While England nursed its own wounds from the failed counter-armada, the Spanish king did something his enemies profoundly underestimated. He rebuilt. With extraordinary speed and methodical determination, Philip poured resources into reconstructing his Atlantic fleet, commissioning new vessels designed with the hard lessons of 1588 in mind. Heavier guns, better provisioning, more experienced commanders. Within just a few years, Spain possessed a navy more capable than the one that had sailed for England in the summer of 1588. The war, meanwhile, refused to end. English privateers continued raiding Spanish shipping. English troops supported Dutch rebels fighting Spanish rule in the Netherlands. Philip responded by planning not one but two additional armadas against England. The Second Armada sailed in October of 1596, roughly 100 ships bound again for the English coast. The English fleet was caught unprepared, still recovering from an expedition to Cadiz earlier that year. It appeared, for a moment, that Spain's patience and persistence were about to be rewarded. Then the Atlantic intervened. Violent autumn storms scattered the fleet with brutal efficiency, sinking dozens of vessels and drowning thousands of men before a single Spanish soldier could set foot on English soil. Philip, now aging and increasingly ill, refused to surrender the objective. A third armada departed in the autumn of 1597, again meeting catastrophic weather in the Bay of Biscay. Again, the fleet turned back in ruin. 3 armadas, 3 failures. Yet the enduring image of Spain as a broken, humiliated power after 1588 fundamentally misreads the historical reality. Throughout this entire period, Spanish treasure fleets continued crossing the Atlantic with remarkable regularity. delivering silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico into Spanish coffers. The empire itself remained intact, its colonies undisturbed, its global trade routes defended. England, for all its celebrated victory of 1588, never seriously threatened Spanish dominance of the Americas. Philip II died in 1598. Exhausted but sovereign, his empire still the largest on earth. His son, Philip III, inherited both the crown and the seemingly endless war with England. That war finally ended not with cannon fire, but with negotiation. In 1604, the Treaty of London brought the Anglo-Spanish War to a close, signed by Philip III and England's new king, James I, who had succeeded Elizabeth upon her death the previous year. Neither side could claim decisive victory. The terms were essentially a return to the status quo, two exhausted powers stepping back from a conflict that had consumed fortunes and generations. The Great Armada of 1588 had not, in the end, decided the fate of empires. It had merely begun a conversation, conducted in storms and cannon smoke, that would take 16 years to conclude. What does it mean to lose a battle but still win a war? For Spain, the answer came slowly across decades, measured not in cannon fire but in the quiet accumulation of consequence. The defeat of the Armada in 1588 had sent a message across Protestant Europe that no sermon could have delivered so powerfully. Catholic Spain, the most formidable military power on earth, could be stopped. The English had proven it. And if England could defy Philip II, so could others. Nowhere did that message land with greater force than in the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic, already fighting for its independence from Spanish rule, drew enormous psychological sustenance from what had happened in the English Channel. Spanish invincibility was a myth, and myths, once shattered, rarely reassemble. Dutch merchants, shipbuilders, and sailors channeled that confidence into commerce with breathtaking ambition. Through the early decades of the 1600s, the Dutch Republic built the most sophisticated trading network the world had yet seen, establishing the Dutch East India Company in 1602 and extending its reach from the Baltic to the Indian Ocean. Amsterdam replaced Antwerp as the financial heart of Europe. A small, waterlogged nation had simply decided it would no longer accept the limits others imposed upon it. England drew its own lessons, though more gradually. The dream of planting permanent settlements in the New World had flickered since the 1580s. The lost colony of Roanoke, that haunting mystery off the Carolina coast, had demonstrated both the ambition and the fragility of English colonization. But the Treaty of London in 1604 freed English resources and English attention for ventures further afield. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown in Virginia, the foothold that would, across generations, grow into something Spain never imagined it would face: a rival civilization in the Western Atlantic. Spain itself did not collapse. Empires rarely do so quickly. The silver still flowed from the Americas. The bureaucratic machinery still ground forward. But the costs of endless European wars, the drain of maintaining garrisons from Milan to Manila, and the challenge of competing with leaner, faster-moving maritime rivals began telling on Spanish finances in ways no quantity of American silver could permanently remedy. By the 1640s, Spain was fighting simultaneous revolts in Portugal and Catalonia, losing Portugal permanently in 1640. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formally recognized Dutch independence, the very outcome Philip II had spent his life and fortune trying to prevent. The Great Armada had not caused all of this. History is never so tidy. But it had marked the moment when Europe began believing that a different order was possible, one where Protestant maritime nations could compete, colonize, and eventually surpass the empire that had dominated the Atlantic world for a century. The ocean had spoken in 1588. The world had spent the following decades learning what it said. History has a way of being rewritten by those who survive it. And few survivals in the English-speaking world have been mythologized as thoroughly or as deliberately as the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Almost before the last storm had scattered the last Spanish galleon, Elizabeth's court was already shaping the story. The Armada portrait, painted around 1588 and attributed to the workshop of George Gower, captures this myth-making impulse with extraordinary precision. Elizabeth sits commanding and serene, her hand resting on a globe, her fingers touching the Americas. Through two windows behind her, the battle unfolds and the Spanish ships founder. The message was unmistakable. God, England, and their queen had turned back the Catholic tide together. That divine partnership found its most enduring expression in a commemorative medal struck after the victory. Its Latin inscription read, Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt, meaning, God breathed and they were scattered. The storms that destroyed so much of the Armada along the Irish and Scottish coasts were not simply weather. They were providence. Protestant England had been chosen. The wind itself was evidence. This was, of course, propaganda. Effective, lasting, and brilliantly executed propaganda. For centuries, British schoolchildren absorbed a version of 1588 in which plucky English sailors and righteous winds defeated the greatest empire on earth. The more complicated reality, including English supply failures, the inconclusive nature of the actual naval engagements, and the significant role of Spanish errors, did not fit neatly into the national story being constructed. Modern historians have spent considerable effort dismantling the myth without entirely discarding its significance. Was 1588 truly a turning point or merely a symbolic one? The debate continues. Some scholars argue that Spain's fundamental power barely registered the blow, that the real shifts in Atlantic dominance took generations longer. Others contend that symbolism is itself a form of power, that the psychological rupture of 1588 reordered European confidence in ways no balance sheet can fully measure. Both arguments contain truth. What archaeology cannot argue with is the physical evidence still lying on the ocean floor. Since the 1960s and 70s, systematic excavations of Armada wrecks off the Irish and Scottish coasts have recovered extraordinary material. Bronze cannons, personal items belonging to ordinary sailors, navigational instruments, and the structural timbers of ships that set out believing they would reshape the world. The wreck of the La Trinidad Valenciana off Donegal and the Girona off the Antrim coast yielded thousands of artifacts now preserved in the Ulster Museum in Belfast. These objects speak without rhetoric. They are simply there, cold and eloquent, on the seabed where the storm left them. What endures most powerfully about the Armada story, stripped of its mythology, is the lesson it carries about the limits of power. Philip II assembled the largest naval force the Western world had ever seen, driven by absolute certainty in his cause, his faith, and his calculations. He had underestimated the weather, the enemy, and the fundamental unpredictability of warfare at sea. Logistics had failed him. Hubris had clouded his planning. The ocean had refused to cooperate with his ambitions. These are not merely 16th century lessons. Every era produces its own version of the invincible armada, the force so overwhelming in theory that its commanders cannot imagine failure. And history, with patient consistency, records what happens next. The fleet that was supposed to conquer England never reached its shores. What it left behind instead was something its architects never intended. A story about the extraordinary distance between power imagined and power achieved, still being told more than 4 centuries later. The Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588 did not merely save England. It shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility and set the course of Atlantic history for generations to come. Subscribe for more stories of ambition, power, and the tides that turn empires.